In this video, we'll discuss cyber risks across the supply chain. This is a second in a series of videos on cyber supply chain risk management. This video is brought to you by the National Cybersecurity Training and Education Center out of Whatcom Community College. The creation of this video was funded by a National Science Foundation Advanced Technological Education grant. My name is Lindamood-Craiger. I'm an Associate Professor of Cybersecurity at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Daytona Beach, Florida. Now, I try to make these video series so that individual videos can be watched standalone, because I know a lot of you don't like to watch 3 videos in succession, but just like to watch one video. So to make it possible to watch these videos standalone, let's go and do a quick recap of what we saw in the first video. So in the first video, we saw a definition of supply chain. And here's another definition that I actually like a little better, but they all mean the same thing. So a supply chain is a network between a company and its suppliers to produce and distribute a specific product to the final buyer. This network includes different activities, people, entities, information, and resources. The supply chain also represents the steps it takes to get the product or service from its original state to the customer. So in the last couple of decades, the supply chain has changed dramatically. Why has it changed? Well, there's a couple of reasons that I'm going to talk about. The first is, over the last few decades, is that there's been a greater reliance on information communication technologies. And that's just defined as, it's like information technology, but focuses on communication technologies, including the internet and wireless networks and cell phones and other communication mediums. Now, for all of you watching this video, I want you to close your eyes and think about not having the internet or wireless technologies or cell phones. And I want you to think about, what would you be doing right now? Well, you wouldn't be watching this video, and probably it would disrupt your daily lives greatly, and it would disrupt everybody's lives greatly. If we look back in the last few decades, as we go further and further back, we used to have very rudimentary technologies, but now we have technologies that's pretty much permeated our daily lives. And so we rely on those technologies. The second thing is the globalization of the marketplace. So what does that mean? Well, it means the economy is less hindered by physical distance. More products and services are acquired from across the globe. And one of the reasons is information communication technologies, or the acronym ICT, is that it's much easier to share goods and products and services using the internet than before the internet existed. And those two things, ICT and the globalization of the marketplace, has had a great impact on the supply chain. Now, this is one of the graphs that we looked at in the last video, and this just shows you a little bit of the complexity of the supply chain. So if you look in the upper left-hand corner, we have something called the program office, and that's just an entity or an organization that wants to buy a product for their business. And below that, you have the prime contractor, and that's essentially the seller. So the program office is the buyer and the prime contractor is the seller. The prime contractor is going to be supplying this product. And when we're talking about products, we're talking about ICT products. So they're going to be hardware and they're going to be software. How is the prime contractor able to provide the program office that product? They could acquire that from a supplier. And that could be acquired from a commercial off-the-shelf product. That is something that's already made. Or the prime contractor could develop something in-house. Or the prime contractor could reuse something that they've already developed. Or the prime contractor could outsource this to another company. And so that would require another supplier. So where is this other supplier coming from? Could they be in the United States? Anywhere on the globe? Are they going to be foreign? Now let's think about that. Even for the U.S. and global and foreign suppliers, those two could require contractors in and of themselves to provide the products. And so if we look back all the way up at the original program office, the program office has no clue where those physical components for the hardware and the software came from, because they could come from essentially every source that you see on this screen. So the supply chain problem is, who made those thousands of physical components that comprise the hardware? Can you trust them? Did they use secure production methods when they're developing and manufacturing their hardware and software? You never know, because there's so many components and so many suppliers of these things that go into the final products. It's almost impossible to know. If you don't know the exact source of hardware physical components and the software code, how do you know they are secure? It's difficult. It may be impossible, but there's ways of mitigating that issue. And so let's revisit the 7 stages of the supply chain. We have the requirement stage, we have the design, we have development and manufacture, and that's broken down because development is for source code and manufacture is for the hardware physical components and products. Then you need to test the software and hardware. Then you need to distribute that to the final end user. And then the end user will go on to use that product, and then they also maintain it. And finally, at some point, there is no use or need for the product anymore, and it needs to be disposed of. We also provided an example of the Maersk cyber incident. And essentially, if you want to go more in depth into that, please go back to the first video. But what happened here is that Maersk is a large shipping container company that ships about 1/5 of the world's cargo across the ocean every year. And they were involved with a cyber incident, which caused their IT global infrastructure to pretty much shut down. It affected 170 offices throughout the world, which caused great delays in getting those products that were on those container ships to the end user. We also discussed a cyber incident involving video compression motherboards. So what you see there is a blank prefabricated board, and then you see that little tiny dot in there in the white circle. Well, that is a hardware implant that would be used for a backdoor by malicious actors. And it was about this size. And if you look at the final product, there's no way you would know that that little component was on that board unless you did really in-depth testing. If you're interested in this, I suggest you go to that URL and see exactly what happened, or go back to the previous video and take a look at the description that I provided, which is still just a very, very high-level overview. So in this video, we're going to review the supply chain phases and risks at each phase for a cyber incident. So this graphic is showing you the flow of the supply chain, and notice that it's broken down by both hardware and software because the terminology used is a little different for each of these. So each of hardware and software requires a requirements phase, which just means that the company who's going to be purchasing the product determines the specifications of the functionality of the product. What is the product supposed to do? The design phase is when they take those requirements and actually start designing, for example, the source code or schematics for the hardware. And in the hardware section, they also do some functional prototyping. Then we move to the development and manufacture phase. And manufacture just means that you're putting together the components for the hardware, or you're starting to code. That is your software development. So you're having the source code, which then produces executable code. And then that moves down to testing. And then you're systematically assessing the product to ensure its functionality and performance. And that goes for both hardware and software. And then, of course, distribution means that once your product, whether it's hardware or software, has passed the testing, then it needs to be shipped somehow to the consumer. And so for hardware products, that involves packaging and warehousing and delivery of the product. And since it's physical, it needs some sort of physical means of transportation, which could be ships or planes or trucks. And of course, software can be delivered in the same way, but also can be delivered over the internet. And once that product gets to the end user, that's when the end user uses that product for its intended functionality. And that includes for both hardware and software, but also hardware and software requires maintenance. And we know as users of software that one way we maintain our software is through periodic updates. And the final phase is the disposal phase. And that's when you no longer need the product, you need to do something with it. You don't just take your computer and throw it out into the garbage. It needs to be dealt with systematically. Because normally if we're talking about an organization, they're going to have very sensitive information on their computers, whether it's HIPAA information or personal identifying information or information about the business. And if we think about, let's say, the military, there's also going to be very critical components in there that they don't want anyone else to access. So that could require disassembling the product into components for recycling, reuse, or delivery to the landfill, or destruction if we're talking about the military. And also in terms of software, you need to uninstall or delete or discontinue the use of the product. And also later on, I'll provide a little more information about disposal, because uninstalling and deleting a product doesn't get rid of the actual data on the hard drive. So some scientists and engineers got together, and what they wanted to do was to be able to determine what the possibilities are of cyber attacks and the associated cyber risks for both hardware and individually software across each of the 7 phases of the supply chain. And this is what you're seeing here in this graphic. And so for hardware and software, the lowest risk are at the requirements phase. For hardware, the highest risk is 0.3 at the manufacturing and development phase. And for software is 0.25 at the distribution phase. And the reason they use these numbers is if you start adding across all the different phases for hardware, that adds to 1. And the same thing for software. They both add to 1. But what this allows is to look at the various risks in between not only the phases within hardware and within software, but also can compare across hardware and software. Now notice here, I didn't use the term cyber attack, because when we think cyber attack, we think a malicious actor, is that we think of a hacker. But I like to use the word malicious actor. But the risks are not necessarily only from malicious actors. They could be non-malicious acts of insiders. For example, if you make an error, if you make a mistake, what's the difference if you had the same sort of incident that was caused by a malicious actor as by a non-malicious actor that just made a mistake? Now, some would argue, yes, there's a little difference in there, but in the end, what we're trying to do is to mitigate those risks, regardless of whether it's a malicious actor or it's just an error made by an insider. So now let's take a look at the requirements phase risks. So as we saw before, risks are considered low in this stage, as requirements may undergo numerous iterative reviews, which would likely be revealed if there was any malicious intent involved. However, a potential issue, once requirements are identified and a supplier for a commercial off-the-shelf product has been selected, systems purchased and fielded, the supplier may be acquired by a non-US competitor, or worse, a potential adversary, which may cause mission disruptions. Now, what am I talking about here? Well, I'm talking about Aegis-class warships. So what is an Aegis-class warship? And by the way, this is the US Navy. They're just advanced warships that use advanced information computing technologies for their warfighting. So they used advanced computing and networking and radar technologies and weapons guidance systems and all those things which actually fall into that definition of ICT. So what is the story behind this? In 2014, the Lenovo Group, which is a Chinese computer manufacturing company, purchased IBM's low-end server business for about $2.3 billion. Now, these servers were installed and an integral part of the U.S. Navy's Aegis combat system. So the primary concern for the Navy was that the servers could be potentially compromised during routine maintenance, such as hardware and/or software upgrades, which would be provided by Lenovo. And then additionally, there was concern that information on the weapon systems could be accessed remotely by Chinese government agents through a back door. Now let's go to the second phase, the design phase. The design stage is where activities are engaged to meet the specified requirements, and abstract capabilities from the requirement stage are combined with additional details of the product's components and functionality by the designers and engineers. So risks in the design stage may just as likely to be caused by unintentional non-malicious acts as intentional acts. And the intentional acts could either be external malicious actors, or it could be a malicious insider. Unintentional non-malicious acts may be due to the lack of due diligence to speed up production and meet product schedules. And so we can break down the design risks according to software and hardware. And for software, this might include the selection of an inappropriate algorithm, or the failure to implement error handling in code, or the failure to include mechanisms for encryption or digital signing, which can cause information leakage. For hardware, components selected may become obsolete by the time a system is put into the field, and original equipment manufacturing components may no longer be available, forcing companies to purchase from suppliers where pedigree is less secure and provenance is more difficult to track using current procedures. What does that last part of that sentence mean? It means that if you have a critical system, you want to know exactly where the physical components came from and where the software was developed and who developed it. A lot of what I'm talking about in this series of videos is based upon a very long 90-page paper that I wrote that was based upon the Department of Defense. And so a lot of my research is based upon the DoD, but this also applies for any company. So in terms of the Department of Defense, there's a real concern as approximately 70% of electronics and fielded weapon systems are obsolete or no longer in production prior to fielding the systems. So in terms of the U.S. Department of Defense, making sure they know the provenance of the components is extremely important. But that also goes for other companies as well. I guess unless you're talking about a toy, then it might not make that big a deal. Although I just thought that there are certain circumstances where you have a toy that has a capability of connecting to the internet, how you might want to make sure that that toy is secure. So now let's move on to the manufacturing of hardware and software development risks. So the manufacture of hardware is normally the most complex stage of the hardware lifecycle. It involves the most participants and activities. So if you think about that, the more people involved, there's more likely to be a non-malicious act that's an error that causes an issue with security, or you could have malicious insiders as well. And a good example of a cyber incident that was probably most likely caused by a malicious actor occurred in 2010, when the computer manufacturing company Dell acknowledged that some of its PowerEdge servers shipped with malware installed on the motherboard's server management firmware. Unfortunately, there is little detail published on the type of malware or its intended function, but the fact that the malware was found on the server management board, which is a board that's applied to a lot of motherboards, which allows an administrator remote access to the computer, suggests that the malware might have functioned as a backdoor, given the purpose of the SMB, the server management board, is to provide remote access to an authorized administrator. Given that the server shipped with malware installed, one might surmise that an insider infected the motherboards or a third-party supplier was the source. Regardless, this was a supply chain attack. Also, software has become more and more complicated, and there's been an intended increase in the lines of code. Well-written code, it has been suggested, may have one bug per 1,000 lines of code. Okay, so what is well-written code? One might guess that there's very little well-written code. If you think about, let's think about the Microsoft Windows operating system. How often do you get updates? I believe it's every second Tuesday of the month. Why are you getting updates? Well, the reason is because there are bugs in the code. And some of these may be security bugs. And quite often they are. Now, if we extend that, so some complicated applications and operating systems have 30 or 40 or 50 million lines of code. So you can do the math and see there could be a lot of bugs even in well-written code. And we already know there are. That's why for our smartphones and for our operating systems, every so often we get an update. Now, some of those are to fix bugs that may not have anything to do with security. But from various sources I read online, a lot of these updates are because there are security bugs in the code. So it's going to happen. There's probably no way to get around that. Okay, now let's move on to testing risks. And essentially, testing is you run a series of tests to determine if the system correctly performs the functions as specified in the requirements and design stages. So let's say you want your software and hardware combination to do A and B and C. And if it passed those tests, if it can do A, B, and C, then it's good. The question is, if we think about the inability to identify the provenance of hardware and software, now we ask, well, sure, this hardware software can do A, B, and C, but what else does it do? Can it do anything else? A lot of times testing doesn't even look at that because it's difficult. So this even goes for Department of Defense weapon systems. In 2018, the General Accountability Office developed a study reviewing Department of Defense weapon systems for security issues. And this was based upon work done by security testers from 2012 to 2017. And the security testers routinely identified critical cyber vulnerabilities in almost all of the weapon systems under development. For example, the system testers were able to gain access to the weapon systems. And remember, these are external system testers to determine if there are any security issues with the weapon systems, where they were able to gain access. Once they gained access, they were able to escalate privileges. So they went from, example, a normal user to a higher class user, a super user. For example, what we would call root on Mac OS or Linux or any version of Unix, or Windows Administrator. Once they did that, they were able to manipulate the controls of the weapon systems. Some teams were able to exfiltrate data up to 100 gigabytes of data. They were able to identify the administrator's passwords. And they were even able to shut down the system through performing a simple passive network scan. Now let's move on to distribution phase risks. Distribution involves the packaging, warehousing, and delivery of a product, system, component, or software from a supplier to the end user customers. Some of the issues in the distribution phase involve counterfeit parts or even entire systems, which are an issue in the distribution stage. For example, in 2008, Cisco, the largest manufacturer of network routers, admitted that its partners sold counterfeit Cisco products to the U.S. military. The FBI identified the counterfeit products that came from Sichuan province of China, but were unable to determine if the goods were made by state-sponsored malign actors or for-profit entities. The FBI noted that the counterfeits could open hardware backdoors, allowing an attacker to gain access and control the router. Additionally, counterfeit products are known to have higher failure rates than original equipment manufacturer equipment, with the FBI noting that one of these counterfeit products caught fire in a government network due to a faulty power supply. Additionally, one company was cited for allegedly selling counterfeit products from China to the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Marine Corps, the Federal Aviation Administration, universities, financial institutions, defense contractors, and to the FBI. Now let's move to the use and maintenance risks. So during this stage, the end user will make use of the system for its intended functionality, as well as maintaining it to ensure it continues to function. So hardware systems often require maintenance, including regular physical maintenance, cleaning, or replacing malfunctioning or worn components. And of course, software updates are common to patch security issues or to add additional functionality to a system. So what are some examples of risks? One of these is changing the default credentials should be an immediate task for the administrator or the user or whoever is in charge of the system, as leaving default credentials can lead to a malign actor's ability to access the system. Now, probably every one of you, or let's say most of you, have a Wi-Fi access point in your house, or you have security cameras. Each of those will come with a default credential. Now I want to ask you, have you changed those default credentials? Because if you hadn't, that means an external malicious actor could be able to access your Wi-Fi access point or your security cameras or whatever other technology that you use that comes with a default credential. There's also something called software update supply chain attacks. Now, what is this? Well, we know that all major operating system and application manufacturers provide regular software updates that remedy security or performance issues. Moreover, many manufacturers support automatic updates so that they occur without manual user intervention and can be scheduled for off-peak hours. Now, malicious actors have exploited these two details to create something called a software update supply chain attack, which increased 78% between the years 2017 and 2018. And that was the only years that I could find any statistics on software update supply chain attacks. Supply chain attack is defined as implanting a piece of malware into an otherwise legitimate software package at its usual distribution location. Now, this can occur during the production at the software supplier, at a third-party storage location, or through redirection. Software update attacks are effective because they exploit a trusted channel, the software manufacturer, and automatic updates allow the malware infections to grow quickly without manual intervention by the malign actor. An example of this, in 2019, a software update supply chain attack occurred that involved malware on Asus laptops. The malign actors leveraged a backdoor attack modifying the Asus Live Update utility that delivers software updates to laptops and desktops. The software utility was digitally signed with a legitimate digital certificate and hosted on an official Asus server that was dedicated to providing updates to Asus computers. It was estimated that 1 million users downloaded the utility. Another risk during this phase is ransomware. And ransomware is malware that encrypts a hard drive. And it exists for pretty much all operating systems, including smartphone operating systems, although there's an asterisk by the iPhone because everything I've seen in terms of ransomware for the iPhone has been more scareware ransomware rather than actual ransomware. But primary targets are Windows-based computers. And let's just look at an example of what we're talking about, just in case that you don't know anything about encryption. So here's a file on my computer. And this is some of the references that I'll be including at the end of this video. And if you see that you can read everything on there, it's all in English, it's all readable. If you encrypt it, this is what you get. And that's one form of encryption. But essentially, in order to make this readable again, it needs to be decrypted. And that means that you need to know the algorithm, the encryption algorithm that was used, as well as the password that was used to encrypt it. But imagine that a malicious actor was able to infect your computer with ransomware. That means that all of the files on your computer are going to look like this. And if that includes the system files, that means your computer will not operate. And if it's just your user files, that means you're not going to be able to read them. The new strains of ransomware are particularly vicious because they spread through an old vulnerability in Windows that allows a single infected computer to infect other Windows computers on the network. Recall when we were talking about the Maersk. A single infected computer on the Maersk network was able to infect computers in 170 offices throughout the world. During the 2018-2019 timeframe, there were dozens of local governments that were victimized by ransomware, including Atlanta, Georgia, Lakeland, Florida, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, several Louisiana parishes, and over 20 local governments in Texas. And according to the 2019 FBI Internet Crime Report, there were 2,047 instances of ransomware reported in that year. And by the way, that's a huge undercount. There's way more instances of ransomware. It's just that a lot of times they're not reported. And I know that for a fact because I have an ex-student who works with a ransomware company that will actually deal with the ransomware and deal with the people behind the ransomware. And none of those people report the crimes. All they want to do is to get back their data. So that's an undercount. Another issue is with cloud services. Companies are increasingly using commercially available cloud services to store and process highly sensitive data, which may reduce their cost, but it also provides an enormous and an increasing attack surface for malign actors to compromise either through external attacks or malicious insiders that are employed by the cloud providers. Cloud service provider Armor identified 621 million attacks on cloud customers in 2018 alone, and some of these included the brute force password attacks, attacks against vulnerable software, web application attacks, and information of things attacks. And finally, we have disposal risks, the disposal phase. So disposal involves the decommissioning and removal of a product at the end of its life. I don't know how old you all are, and if you're young, you've probably never decommissioned a smartphone, or maybe you have, or a computer, but in my life, I've decommissioned a lot of smartphones, a lot of phones, and a lot of ICT. Hardware disposal involves disassembly for reuse, recycling, or destruction, and software disposal includes uninstalling, deleting, or otherwise discontinuing the use of the product. Software disposal requires permanently removing all remnants of software and data from storage devices. The number one threat in the disposal stage can be caused by the lack of due diligence in not securely deleting sensitive files from a system's storage device, usually the hard drive. So what does that word securely deleting mean? Well, normally when you delete a file, all the deletion process does is to change essentially a single character in, let me use an analogy here, the table of contents of files. And that indicates to the operating system that the space that was once used by that file can now be reused. When you delete a file, the metadata about the file name, the file size, where it starts, the modified access and created times is not removed, nor are the contents. And so if you think that just deleting a file in the usual way of right-clicking and saying delete deletes a file, it doesn't do it. What you need to do to securely delete a file is essentially overwrite that file. That is, the space that was used, the contents, is to overwrite that with other characters. Now this may differ a little bit depending on what type of storage device you're using, if you're using an old mechanical hard drive or one of the newer SSDs, but regardless, deleting a file doesn't necessarily delete the contents. So what have we learned? We've learned that each stage of the supply chain is susceptible to attack and therefore has an associated risk. We found that the possibility of risk differs by the stage of the supply chain, and that even differs whether it's hardware or software. We know that risk can be from malicious actors or from non-malicious actors, yet potentially harmful acts by insiders. We also know that the manufacturing and development and use and maintenance stages have the greatest risks. That's for now. That may change in the future. And finally, let me talk a little bit about the last video. So in the first video and the second video, we've talked about the stages of the supply chain and the various risks associated with each stage. In the last video, we will describe the government guidelines and regulations for mitigating those risks. That is, trying to reduce the risks of those events occurring. And we call this risk management. This video has been brought to you by the National Cybersecurity Training and Education Center out of Whatcom Community College.